The Whitakers had always been the kind of family that believed in visible lines, the line of their 3-story farmhouse against the sky, the line of generations carved into the family Bible, the line between what belonged to them and what did not. In the small Ohio town of Maple Grove, Whitaker Farm had been more than land, it was an identity. For decades the Whitaker name hung on every barn board and every line of credit, and Henry Whitaker's photo still hung in the Maple Grove Historical Society with a brass plaque. Founder, farmer, man who kept his promises. Emily Whitaker grew up under those promises. She learned to tell weather by the smell of the soil and learned, too, that arguments over the kitchen table could be turned into repairs done by dusk. She loved the farm the way some people loved a childhood home, not as a museum, but as the place where mistakes could be made, apologies given, and life restarted. Henry, her father, was tall with hands that had known both plough and pen. He'd run the farm responsibly through drought and boom, and when opportunity knocked in the form of a modest executive in Cleveland, Henry negotiated smartly. He also trusted certain people by habit. He'd known Gregory Stanton since high school and considered his company's new subdivision project to be an engine for the town. When Gregory proposed acquiring a portion of Whitaker land for development, quiet boulevard, a few houses, maybe a small park, he said, Henry signed the agreement after Gregory promised that a greenbelt would surround their west field and that the town would benefit. It was Emily who found out the truth. She was home from college for the summer, thinking she'd take over the family paperwork, while Dad recovered from a surgery. While scanning through the developer's paperwork in the kitchen, all stamped and notarized and smelling faintly of printer ink, she noticed a clause tucked away in small print, an easement that would allow Gregory Stanton's company permanent runoff control easements and the right to redirect a creek that had run through Whitaker lands for a century. That clause did not just allow a rerouting of water, it gave the developer the right to install a storm channel that would cut across the back fields and, crucially, to claim those acres if the Whitakers ever fell behind on property taxes. Dad is never late on taxes, Emily told herself when she called Henry. The call lasted 12 minutes. Henry laughed softly and then said the things fathers say to stop worry. Greg's a friend, it's all above board, but Emily's stomach would not loosen. 2 months later, a meeting convened at Town Hall. Gregory Stanton smiled as if the sun had been measured and he had the exact recipe for it. He presented plans for Maple Ridge Estates, manicured lawns, low-slung houses with porches, a new cul-de-sac that would increase property values and bring families to a town more interested in convenience than continuity. He had promotional renderings, tax incentives, and an entire stack of legal endorsements. A few neighbors nodded, the mayor asked a few polite questions and the meeting slid to approval. The Storm Channel project was front-page news for a week. It was celebrated with hot coffee and small editorials praising progress. No one asked, who would maintain the channel if the developer's project faltered? Who would be responsible if the new water pattern flooded the low-lying orchard behind the farmhouse? No one asked because the answers sat folded in a clause most people had not read. Autumn came, bitter and bright. A drought that had stressed crops all summer was suddenly replaced by a week of torrential rains. The new channel, not yet fully constructed, mostly trenches and heavy equipment, funneled the rain in ways the old creek never had. Water flowed over low banks, slipped under fences, and by midnight the back fields of the Whitaker farm were turning into a patchwork of mud and drowned roots. Sheds floated on swollen brown currents. The orchard, where Emily had once learned to climb and sneak peaches, was a half-sunken ruin. Henry blamed himself. Gregory called it an unfortunate circumstance. The company's insurance would cover some of the damage, they said, but the clause Emily had found whispered in her mind, those acres would be forfeit if taxes or upkeep were neglected. Henry, sick from his surgery complications and exhausted from a lifetime of hands-on fixes, could not mobilize the farm's defenses. Workers were scarce. The town's attention moved on. Within 6 months, the company filed a lien, and when the Whitakers tried to negotiate, Gregory's legal team pointed to the easement and the exact wording that had been engineered to favor the developer in cases of adverse environmental events causing sustained loss. The legal fight was petty and brutal. Gregory, a man who loved the feel of control, used every procedural lever. Lawyers appeared and disappeared like low clouds. Offers were made with the soft touch of a hand that wanted to persuade, and the hard edge of a knife he kept for emergencies. The Whitakers argued and presented photographs and the old maps that had been in the family chest for generations. They pleaded past dealings, phone calls made in good faith, the history of the creek that supported migratory birds. The judge could see both sides, the law and the loss. There was a verdict that left the Whittakers with acreage sold, the orchard declared a liability, and the Whittaker homestead hemmed in by a thin ribbon of town road. That winter the Whittakers sold the West Field, more than half their livelihood, to stave off foreclosure. Henry retreated inward, more fragile than he let on. Lorraine, Emily's mother, packed the old church quilts and tried to make a steady front. Emily, furious and hollow, bristled at every town conversation that praised Gregory's vision. Gregory became the face of Maple Ridge, the man who brought tax revenue and holiday lights. He also became a part of every family's social feed: ballpark sponsorships, ribbons at the county fair, and a cheerful photograph in front of a banner. At Thanksgiving, when Henry quietly refused to raise a toast to the developer, Gregory was absent only because Emily would not have let him through the door. Emily tried the legal route. She walked to the small law practice on Main and asked for help. The lawyers she found were competent and decent, but they kept circling back to the same phrase: contract law is rigid. The clause had been drafted precisely. Gregory had protected his back with language and precedent. They negotiated settlements that would return small amounts. They asked for payment plans and forgiveness. Each meeting felt like a slow folding of a map that led away from what the Whittakers had once owned. It was in those negotiations that Emily met Claire Connors, Gregory's former assistant, and a woman who had left the Stanton firm with a small, bitter smile and a file folder of her own. Claire's brother had lost land in a similar deal years before. She knew how the deals were structured, the shell companies, and the way public hearings could be swayed with the weight of carefully placed endorsements. She told Emily in a bar that smelled of old wood and citrus beer, "He didn't just build houses, he built a mechanism for consolidation. He doesn't take, he systematizes." "We go public," Emily said once in the white light of the kitchen at 2 a.m, pages scattered like fallen leaves. "We tell the town what he did." "No," Claire said. "You can tell the town and he'll beat you in the court of public opinion and then in the court of law. He has lawyers who are practiced at drowning whistleblowers in paperwork. If you want to change this, you have to change the game." Emily learned then that revenge required a shape, that it could not be mere anger. It needed an architecture, an assembly of small, careful actions. She could not live with the orchard sunk in mud and a developer smiling in town photos. She could not watch her father diminish like the letters on a faded deed, so she began to plan. She read title transfers until her eyes watered. She learned about shell corporations and about how a single clause in a long document could be the hinge of an entire business model. She started to keep lists in a leather notebook, names, dates, phone numbers, and when the town slept she called the people who had reasons to keep their own secrets. A clerk in zoning who resented Gregory's arrogance, a realtor whose pensions depended on stable property values, a landscape architect who'd watched wetlands drained and felt guilty in the quiet hours. Little by little, she gathered evidence and human alliances. The Whittaker family, diminished but not broken, started to gather around a new center. Not the acres they had lost, but the truth. Emily could feel the family's pulse changing. Henry would still go out some mornings and touch the fence posts as if to remind himself where he stood. Lorraine baked late at night and left pies on the secretary's desk at church with notes that said thank you. Daniel, Emily's younger brother, trained a small camera drone and learned to record at angles that made every machine look menacing. When spring returned, Emily had prepared a small case file she intended to present to the county commission. It was not only about the Whittakers, it was about method. She wanted to show that Gregory Stanton's company had used statutory loopholes to consolidate parcels across multiple towns, and that the environmental changes they had authorized were not merely incidental, but predictable in design. The commission meeting was crowded, with more townspeople than the hall could comfortably hold. Emily spoke last, after a parade of voices that ranged from cautious praise for development to frustrated pleas about property taxes. When she described the easement and read the clause aloud, slowly with recall, she watched faces shift. Some people turned away, others whispered. Daniel's drone footage played on the wall. Orchard trees bent and broken, a fence line that used to mark the Whittaker property now swallowed by a drainage cutlet. Gregory Stanton was there, thin-lipped and courteous, as if listening to a symphony that did not include him in the crescendo. He could not avoid the public view, but public view was easy to manage. His PR team drafted responses that spoke of progress, collaboration, and unfortunate incidents. The commission asked for further study. The town applauded politely and then left for coffee. Emily had not expected a miracle from a single meeting. She had expected instead to start an engine. The engine would have pistons that turned in court, in public, and in the documents that bounded property. She had learned that the law could be used both to take and to reclaim. Now she had to build a plan to use it. When people in Maple Grove thought about power, they imagined it as money or influence or votes. Emily began to think of power in other terms: leverage, patience, and the slow, methodical accumulation of proof. She knew that if Gregory Stanton had designed a mechanism, it could be reversed with the same patient calculation. The first component of her plan was to widen the circle. She could not fight with the Whittakers alone. She needed others who had been pressed by Gregory's schemes. Claire Connors became crucial. Her knowledge of Stanton's internal structure, how regional subsidiaries were created to mask ownership, how land acquisitions were labelled as community enhancement, was the map Emily needed. Claire introduced Emily to Richard Hale, a veteran reporter from the Cleveland Ledger who had a nose for corporate patterns and a stubborn sense of civic duty. Richard listened for a long time and then said bluntly, "I'll look if you have documents." They collected documents like a choir collects voices: deeds, emails, contrived municipal endorsements, and chain of title problems that the developer's legal team had patched with little transactions. Emily learned a new discipline, not just to read legalese, but to spot anomalies. A signature on a deed that looked right at first glance might have been notarized using a notary whose stamp was later shown to have been inactive on that date. A community trust that claimed to have contributed to local parks might exist only on paper, its director a friendly front for a parking lot company. Emily and Claire worked long nights. They sketched charts showing how ownership passed through 3 shell entities before arriving at Maple Ridge LLC. They lined up small but telling details: a shipment manifest showing heavy machinery delivered to a site at times when no permits had been issued, a subcontractor who testified to instructions to backdate documents, an internal email from an executive at Stanton Enterprises about smoothing the path for a particular parcel. The more they assembled, the more patterns emerged. Richard published a 2-part series in the Ledger, careful and precise. He did not write to inflame, he wrote to inform, showing documents and timelines and naming companies. The paper's web metrics spiked. The story was excerpted on regional news and shared at civic meetings. People who had shrugged about the Whittakers' loss sat up and asked how many other families had seen similar clauses buried in glossy proposals. Public pressure began to press on the legal system in a new way. County prosecutors, who had been content to let civil suits sort property disputes, began to ask questions about whether any criminal behavior, fraud, forgery, conspiracy, had been involved. One small clue ignited an investigation: a notarized document that, when compared under magnification, showed the same pen stroke in 2 places that suggested a single person had completed multiple signatures in the stead of different witnesses. The forensic team had the resources now to look more closely. Gregory Stanton reacted the way dangerous men do when their house of cards is threatened, with legal acrobatics and personal charm. He invited the mayor to a dinner, sponsored a youth team, and wrote an op-ed in the Ledger about community development. He argued that any alleged clerical mistakes were accidents, that his company had fulfilled obligations, and that Whittaker's complaint was sour grapes. Emily found, however, that Gregory's charm had limits when matched with documented evidence. Depositions began, signed affidavits produced. Some of Stanton's smaller associates, clerks, subcontractors, a junior lawyer who had once acted as a notary, faced the uncomfortable light of discovery. Offers of immunity in exchange for testimony appeared on the prosecutor's table. A surveyor who had been paid under the table to shift property lines agreed to cooperate. He produced a taped phone call where an operative associated with Stanton's office instructed him to make sure the map reads as planned. Now the fight moved into the world of criminal inquiry. The local sheriff's office, having grown embarrassed by partisan optics, began to pass boxes of evidence to federal investigators on white-collar crime. The scale of the inquiry grew. Stanton Enterprises found itself named in subpoenas covering multiple counties. Inside Stanton's office, pressure mounted. Board members who had once admired Gregory's appetite for expansion began to worry that their reputations were at risk. Investors in the suburban development project, grew nervous when banks started to freeze accounts tied to suspicious transfers. The PR team moved into damage control mode, and Gregory moved into litigation. Emily watched all of it from a vantage that felt equal parts vindication and dread. She had wanted to reclaim her land. She had not expected to open a chain reaction that could unseat a man in the community. There were personal costs. Daniel, who had been photographed investigating machinery at night, received a threatening letter, a thin envelope with a single sentence, "Stop or you will hurt someone you love." Henry received cold calls asking if he had chronic illness that compromised his cognitive judgment. Lorraine woke to find a dead deer on the family gate one morning with a ribbon wrapped around its antlers. The threats were small, staged to cause fear rather than physical harm, but intimidation is its own weapon. The Whittakers tightened their circle. Emily installed lights and cameras. She advised her parents to attend medical checks together and to drive only with company. The town, watching the crescendo of articles and litigation, grew polarized. Some still cheered for development, others felt they had been hoodwinked. The prosecution's case, however, remained uneven. Large corporations hire teams of lawyers whose craft is delay. They request document extensions, file motions, make technical objections. Emily learned to wait in courtrooms full of people who had never been there before and who found their voices only after the judge banged the gavel. She learned that time was a variable you could not control, only influence. So she took a more direct line: financial leverage. If Gregory's empire depended on banks and investors, then exposing irregularities could make those institutions withdraw. Claire and Emily worked with Richard to prepare a follow-up article showing that several banks had processed suspicious transfers tied to consultancy fees that were unusually large. Tax authorities began audits. Audits lead to fear. Fear leads to withdrawn capital. Stanton Enterprises had creditors who asked for documentation. The first creditor to blink was a regional bank that had provided lines of credit, specifically for the Maple Ridge project. When auditors found transfers that looked like circular payments, money that left one Stanton account and reappeared months later under another, they froze lines pending investigation. Contractors stopped getting paid. The construction trailers were quiet. Houses half-built had tarps where frames should have been. Gregory's posture hardened. He started to call board members and shout into his phone. His social media changed from photos of ribbon cuttings to terse statements. He filed countersuits alleging defamation and malicious prosecution. Yet in boardrooms and bank vaults, the sound was not of confidence, but of careful recalculation. Emily's choices became more risky. She arranged for a confidential meeting with an investor who was cutting ties in fear of reputational damage. The investor, a private equity manager from Cleveland, was a man who kept his money as a statement. When he decided to withdraw, it was a public signal. Emily needed him to do more than withdraw. She needed him to testify about the kind of due diligence he had requested when the project had shown odd accounting. He agreed, partly from principle and partly because his own name was now at risk. As pressure mounted, Gregory began to make mistakes. He authorized a payment to a known shell account in a way that left a paper trail. He dictated an email in which he suggested instructing a municipal official to handle the signatures. Those words were recorded and later introduced in court. The prosecutor filed new charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, mail fraud, and facilitating false documentation. In depositions, the junior lawyer who had once notarized forms under time pressure testified that he had been told to sign for the good of the project, a phrase that sounded both patronizing and criminal. The hearings took on the air of a slow-motion collapse. Gregory found himself sitting in a conference room while cameras clicked and reporters typed. He was arrested on a white-collar indictment that made his actions sound both petty and systematic. The town was stunned. For weeks, the only thing that changed faster than the news cycle was the social calculus of Maple Grove: who would be photographed with whom, who would speak at candidates' rallies, and which businesses would remove Stanton signage from their front windows. Emily had anticipated retaliation and had taken precautions. She had secured whistleblower protections for key witnesses. She had worked with federal agents to keep certain evidence out of public reach until charges were filed. She had insured her family's home and set aside funds for legal defense, but she had not anticipated how much the courtroom victories would cost them in daily life. Henry, who had always found solace in early mornings on the porch, now felt eyes in town that made his steps tentative. Lorraine stopped attending Wednesday quilting group. Daniel, who had been eager and brave, kept a lookout for shadows in his rearview. And yet the legal pressure worked. Stanton Enterprises board froze Gregory's control temporarily, pending internal investigations. Federal prosecutors pressed charges in multiple counties. The banks retracted loans and requested stricter oversight. Gregory's empire was not gone by no means, but it was diminished, and the legal system had concrete evidence that he had built his success at the expense of families like the Whittakers. As the indictments piled up, Emily found herself at an odd juncture. Justice, she realized, would not necessarily be proportionate. Even if Gregory were convicted, the money spent on legal battles and the headaches of litigation would not return the orchard or the Westfield's sweet soil. She had won a moral victory and a legal opening, but she had also opened a wound in her family, a wound of attention, of reputation, of time. She contemplated retribution in a practical sense. Emily wanted Gregory to lose more than money. She wanted his network to dissolve, and for his reputation to feel the permanent sting of accountability. She wanted those he trusted to reassess their allegiances. She wanted a structural change that would make such a scheme harder to repeat in Maple Grove and the counties beyond. She wanted quietly for him to feel what it was to have the ground shift beneath his feet. The next phase required cunning rather than just litigation. Emily began to look for contract failures, unpaid promises, and unsettled debts. She and her allies started to build a case for civic reform, ordinances that would require transparency in developers' ownership, a public registry for easements, and stricter oversight for environmental impact assessments. These were not the kind of things that would hum in the evening news, but they would matter in small ways to families that might otherwise be prey to predatory consolidation. This was a new kind of revenge, not merely personal, but preventative. It meant taking the pain that had happened to the Whittakers and attempting to harden the town against future harm. She organized town hall workshops with Claire and Richard, bringing in legal experts to explain how common clauses could be used deceptively. She worked with sympathetic council members to draft legislation making easements clearer and requiring notarized witnesses to be publicly logged. It was dry work, full of meeting minutes and public comment, but it spread awareness, and awareness often affects decisions before the lawyers do. The bills were not guaranteed. Lobbyists representing builders and banks pressed back. Stanton's board, even as it distanced from Gregory, funneled funds through other channels to support candidates who opposed tighter oversight. Politics in a small town, Emily discovered, was still about relationships, money-bent conversations. Still, when the first ordinance passed, requiring extended public disclosure for any development request that included easements that affected more than one parcel, Emily felt a small, hot satisfaction. It would not bring back the orchard, but it would force transparency in future deals. It was a blade that would be blunt to a man with influence, but sharp for someone who relied on hidden clauses. The town had learned something. It had also chosen sides. As trials moved forward and indictments were served, Gregory's public persona crumbled. He defended himself on television interviews with practiced lines, but his eyes betrayed him. He had built his life on the assumption that the world would accept his framings, that terms like improvement and community benefit could be cast as virtues while quietly cutting into backyard orchards. Now he sat in arraignment rooms and argued with constables. The legal system ground on, and Michael Stanton, Gregory's younger brother and a silent partner in the firm, began to approach the Whittakers discreetly. He offered, through intermediaries, a settlement, money in exchange for silence. The offer was large enough to restore parts of the farm and to pay for medical needs. It whispered of easy closure. Emily considered it. Henry wanted security. Lorraine, pragmatic and kind, saw the option as a way to purchase time and peace. Daniel wanted a return to routines, but Emily hesitated. To accept would be to let him buy discretion and keep his pattern intact. To refuse would be to risk more strain and a long fight. The choice was not simply legal or financial, it was moral. It asked whether justice could be bought off or whether a public reckoning was necessary for deterrence. In the end, Emily refused, not because she loved litigation or spectacle, but because she had seen how patterns repeat when the costs are private and the gains public. She refused because other families might not have the time or stamina to fight. She wanted the system changed, not a single wound covered in money. The Whittakers tightened their belt, financially and emotionally, and prepared for a courtroom that promised to last the length of seasons. The trials were long, textured, and often tedious. They were composed of witnesses with shaky recollection and documents that required forensic annotation. There were moments that rose to drama: the surveyor's confession, the notary's admission, the tape of an operative's voice laughing about moving lines. There were also long stretches where lawyers argued about admissible evidence in voices that echoed through the courthouse corridors like rain on tin roofing. The prosecution, fortified by forensic accounting and layered testimony, pushed forward. Jury selection took days, because selecting a group of people who had not been touched by development or architecture of image was nearly impossible in a region where real estate and reputations were intertwined. Some jurors resisted, afraid of the economic consequences if a local titan were felled. Others were moved by the simple logic of wrongdoing exposed. Emily watched every day she could, though she had responsibilities at the farm and her mother's health to consider. She waited in the gallery and kept the leather notebook in her lap like a talisman. Lorraine, who had become suddenly careful with her voice, attended with small scarves and a patience that matched the slow cadence of proceedings. Daniel recorded what he could. His drone had been subpoenaed as evidence, the footage of the rains and channel a critical visual that even the best lawyer could not spin away. Then came the key moment, a deposition by Gregory himself conducted under oath. Gregory was practiced and smooth, but under pressure he began to falter. It was not that he lied, he was practiced at shade and semantics, but the pattern of his meaning shifted. Where he had once called something an unfortunate administrative error, the depositions and the papers laid out a sequence of choices with intention. The junior lawyer testified that he'd been asked to expedite documents and later acknowledged that what had been called expediting was sometimes indistinguishable from fabrication. When the verdicts finally emerged from the jury, guilty on multiple counts related to fraud and causing property loss through the misuse of easements, the courthouse felt as if a long-held breath had been released. The sentence included restitution orders, and more significantly for the town, federal oversight for a period that would force Stanton Enterprises to undergo audits. Gregory was given prison time and fines, but more importantly his credibility was shattered. His firm limped forward, but it could not operate with the same ease. Lenders were wary and contracting partners reticent. The immediate legal victory did not erase the Whittakers' losses. The orchard would never be what it was, but the verdict set a precedent. Prosecutors in neighboring counties used the case to justify their own investigations. Banks began to ask tougher questions. A pattern had been exposed that made predatory consolidation more difficult elsewhere. Emily felt relief but also something like exhaustion. Victory, she learned, carried its own residue. Henry's health had nosedived under the long stress of litigation. Lorraine had become older in the last 2 years in ways that felt inexorable. Daniel, restless and impatient, spoke often of leaving town for a fresh start. The Whittaker family had reclaimed a measure of justice, but it came at quiet, personal expense. In the weeks after the verdict, Emily received messages from people she did not know. Families from nearby counties sent letters thanking her for showing them what to look for. A mother wrote to say she had prevented a similar easement from passing. A retired notary wrote to offer mentorship to the town's youth on civic responsibility. Claire continued to work with Emily on transparency initiatives, and Richard's reporting had spun off into a regional series that made developers more cautious. The town itself began to change in small ways. The new ordinance increased public oversight. A small committee of citizens formed to review major land use proposals and to provide plain language summaries of what developers proposed. A homeowners' rights group met in the church basement and packed it with people who now understood how legalese could erode their futures. It was not perfect. There were still those who believed development was progress, and reasonable people could disagree. But the town had, in its own imperfect way, learned a lesson in vigilance. For the Whittakers, the coming years were quieter. The family sold off a portion of the remaining land to create a trust that would fund farm education and small grants for families facing legal attacks on property. The trust was named the Orchard Trust, in memory of the old trees that once fed generations of Whittakers and neighbours. They used the restitution funds in part to rebuild the barn, and in part to fund community legal clinics that helped people read documents before signing. Henry, who had once been a litigator of soil, began to spend mornings watching the sunrise and speaking softly about seasons. He would not return to the Westfield in the way he had once known it, but he found small pleasure in the repaired barn and in Lorraine's pies on Wednesdays. Lorraine, who had been steady through the storm, started teaching kids at the school how to knit. Daniel eventually took a job in Columbus but returned on weekends to help at harvest time. He married, and sometimes they brought a niece to spend summers at the farmhouse learning to climb safely. Emily, who had been the engine of change, found a new vocation. She did not go into politics or law officially. Instead, she opened a small consultancy that helped rural communities review development proposals. The business paid modestly but provided her with a sense that the cost of their fight could be turned into a service. She provided workshops, pro bono consultations, and a hotline for suspicious clauses. She did not become complacent, she remained watchful. The leather notebook from the early days, now thicker and dog-eared, sat on her desk as a reminder. Years later, at a community picnic in which Maple Grove celebrated both the new community centre and the memory of the orchard, Gregory Stanton wrote a letter. He had been released early on good behaviour and had moved out of state. His letter apologised in guarded terms, claiming that he had never intended the harm he caused and that business practices had been misinterpreted. The town's response was mixed. Some felt a kind of public penance was owed, others scoffed at the notion of sincere contrition. Emily read the letter with a calm she did not always feel. She had not wanted a confession to be the end of it. Her end had been systems changed and families enabled. The letter read like the old man himself, careful, still expecting to influence how his future would be read. At the picnic, Emily watched children run and parents sit in lawn chairs and laugh, and she thought of the way power had flowed through their town and how, for a few critical seasons, she had decided to challenge it. She thought of the orchard silently composting beneath new grasses and of Henry's hands, which had tended more soil than most in Maple Grove. She thought of Clea, who had become a friend and ally, and Richard, who had written the ledger pieces that had moved a region. The Whittaker family still grieved in small ways. There were nights when Henry sat alone and studied old maps with a softness that could not be reconstructed. Lorraine sometimes walked to the boundary where the west field had been and stood with her eyes closed as if hearing the ghosts of apples falling. Daniel, who had once been impatient, had a new maturity. He visited with a niece who called him Uncle Dan and taught her how not to be afraid of bees. Emily, at the end of the day, continued to write. Her leather notebook filled with notes for workshops, with receipts of deeds that were now safer, with names of people she planned to help. She had not sought revenge to sate a private hunger, she had sought to change a pattern. In doing so, she had reshaped both her family's fate and, in a small but real way, the governance of a region. When the town commissioned a small plaque to be placed near the community garden, a modest bronze square that read, "For community integrity and the memory of the Whittaker Orchard 20XX, Emily touched the edge with a finger and smiled a small, private smile. The plaque did not replace the orchard, nor did it erase the nights of worry. But it marked something, that ordinary people, when they acted with care and resolve, could hold those in power accountable. There is a moral to stories like this, though it is not neat. Power bent and vast can be resisted with paperwork and courage, but the cost will always be paid somewhere. The Whittakers paid with years of strain and nights of fear, but they also paid with the rebuilding of a town that would be harder to deceive. The family's revenge had not been to topple a man and keep his golden spoils, it had been to transform a wound into a system that protected others. On a late summer evening, Emily walked the perimeter of the farm with Lorraine and Henry. They listened to the quiet, to the call of a distant train and the soft hum of insects. Emily thought of the price they had paid and the price of the changes they'd made. She thought of the orchard that would live in memory for a generation to come. She thought of the small children playing in the community garden, their knees dirty and their laughter clean. When she finally put her hand on the porch rail and looked at the house where she had grown up, she felt the weight of everything and the soft buoyancy of a future not yet written. The Whittakers had survived. They had been remade, and in the remaking they had learned how to name a wrong and to change the law that allowed it. That in the end was their revenge, not a spectacle of humiliation, but a reconfiguration of power so others would not walk blind into the same trap.